In the early spring of 2013, the isolated seaside community of Greywater Bay, Oregon, was just beginning to stir after a long, bruising winter. For weeks, the ocean had battered the cliffs, but that April, the air turned unexpectedly soft. The week before, Easter felt almost enchanted. Warm breezes carried the mingled scents of pine needles and salt spray, and wildflowers bloomed weeks ahead of schedule, splashing the cliff tops with improbable color. Longtime residents would later remember that week as the calm before a storm no one could name. Far from the tourist pier and the lighthouse, 5 students from Greywater Bay Community College had been planning what they called their final escape before graduation. They weren't thrill-seekers in the usual sense, but each felt an itch to do something unforgettable together, one last adventure before adulthood scattered them. Their chosen destination was the Ashen Rift Nature Reserve, a sprawling maze of slot canyons and hidden chambers about 30 miles inland. Unlike the carefully charted Grand Canyon, the Rift had a reputation for swallowing maps and confusing even seasoned hikers. Its weather could turn without warning. Its footpaths dissolved into gullies. Its caves wound back on themselves like a living labyrinth. Few people ever went beyond the first couple of miles. The group was a tapestry of contrasts. 2 young men, Elias Brenner, a restless geology major with a habit of climbing fences to reach restricted overlooks, and Noah Calder, a soft-spoken photography student who saw the world in frames and shadows, and 3 young women, Harper Lane, a self-taught botanist with jars of pressed flowers in her dorm room, Sienna Ward, a journalism student obsessed with unsolved mysteries, and Isla Reyes, a collegiate track athlete only recently cleared to train again after a brutal knee injury. They were between 20 and 22, each carrying a backpack heavy not only with gear, but with unspoken hopes and private fears. On the cool gray morning of April 10th, they loaded up their equipment: lightweight stoves, climbing ropes, notebooks for sketches and field notes, and Noah's battered 35mm camera, whose leather strap had nearly frayed through. Before sunrise, in the empty gravel parking lot at the Ashen Rift trailhead, they posed for a photograph that would later take on the weight of an omen. In it, Elias grins, a folded map sticking out of his back pocket. Harper cradles a jar with a single cobalt blue wildflower she'd plucked from the cliff edge. Isla's knee brace peeks out from under her shorts. Noah's face is turned slightly away, as though something in the tree line had caught his attention. None of them could have guessed this would be the last picture of them alive. Ashen Rift carried its own folklore. Old miners' journals spoke of underground rivers carving secret shafts, of echoing voices long after dusk, of a place hikers called the Turning Point, where compasses spun and shadows lengthened unnaturally. Sienna, ever the skeptic, had printed out an article titled "Debunking the Rift Legends" to read aloud and laugh about during the trip. The others chuckled, but in the photograph, Noah's blurred gaze hinted at something unsaid, a flicker of unease that the camera accidentally caught. That morning, the 5 friends stepped onto the overgrown path leading toward the gorge. Mist rose from the cliffs like smoke, swallowing their silhouettes one by one. Hours later, a Pacific storm rolled inland faster than forecasts predicted, erasing their footprints as though the earth itself wanted no record of their passage. By dusk, they had vanished. By the time the storm had passed that evening, Greywater Bay felt oddly muted, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. Families expecting cheerful updates began dialing phones that rang once, then went straight to voicemail. Elias's father, a retired park ranger who had walked those canyons more times than he could count, was the first to sense genuine danger. He knew precisely how long it should take to reach the rift's first plateau. The absence of any message chilled him. When darkness settled over the town with no sign of the group, the families contacted the sheriff's office. Search parties assembled within hours, flashlights and search dogs moving through the dripping underbrush. But the terrain had changed under the storm's weight. Paths collapsed, new rivulets cut across the trails, and fog rose again, as if to erase the rescuers' progress. Not a single footprint remained, no camping gear, no broken branches to suggest direction. It was as though the five had been lifted out of the landscape entirely. Over the following week, regional news stations picked up the story, dubbing it the Rift Vanishings. Old files surfaced, local disappearances going back decades. In Sienna's dorm room, investigators found her neatly organized research, articles, printouts, and handwritten notes about the Ashen Rift's legends. Some dated to the 1940s, describing miners who vanished in sudden mists. One, from the 1970s, recounted a lone hiker found half-mad, clutching a notebook filled with symbols no one could decipher. Among Sienna's printouts was a map marked with a dotted red line labeled Hollow Vein. A rumored subterranean artery twisting beneath the canyon floor. Elias's father bristled at talk of curses or ghosts. He was convinced the gorge's shifting terrain had disoriented the hikers and that they were lost in some remote chamber. Yet even after professional cavers were flown in, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and thermal drones, the search returned nothing but cold stone and silence. Then, on the 14th day, a hiker following an unmarked ledge stumbled across something improbable. A small field journal lying open, its pages damp but intact. Pressed between two pages was a single cobalt blue wildflower, the same type Harper had carried in the photo. The journal's last entries contained rough sketches of winding tunnels and hand-drawn symbols etched on canyon walls. Repeated across one page, in jagged handwriting, "Do not follow the echoes." The discovery ignited a fever in town. Cafes buzzed with speculation. Fishermen claimed to see lights flickering inside cliffside caves at night. Teenagers dared each other to sneak to the trailhead and listen for whispers on the wind. The Ashen Rift, once a quiet curiosity, became a living wound in the town's imagination. Weeks bled into months, and Greywater Bay changed. People spoke in hushed voices at the diner. Even the gulls circling the pier seemed quiet. The journal and the blue wildflower had become talismans of fear and fascination. Rumors took on lives of their own. Some locals claimed they could hear distant voices drifting up from the rift at night. Others swore they'd seen pale lights flicker in caves no map admitted existed. Then, one cold dawn in late June, a kayaker skimming the edge of the Ashen Rift's lower gorge spotted something glinting in a shallow stream. It was a camera. Noah's battered 35mm, its leather strap twisted and torn. Miraculously, the memory card was intact. Within hours, it was in the sheriff's office, and by evening the families gathered in a darkened room above the station to watch the recovered images on a projector. At first, the photographs were ordinary. Elias balancing on a boulder, Harper laughing with a wildflower behind her ear, Isla stretching her injured knee, Sienna gesturing animatedly at some point off camera. But in the backgrounds behind their shoulders, in the shadows of canyon walls, something else lurked. Shapes without clear features. Elongated silhouettes that did not match any of the five. In some frames, faint, translucent forms seemed to lean toward the group, blurred as though the camera itself couldn't quite capture them. The sheriff dismissed the images as light artifacts or moisture on the lens. But the families were unconvinced. One image in particular became infamous. The five standing on a narrow ledge above a dark chasm, their faces frozen mid-expression shock, maybe recognition, as they stared at something just outside the frame. There was no next photo. The sequence ended abruptly, as if the camera had stopped at the exact instant of revelation. For Elias's father, it was the breaking point. Official search teams had been scaled back, but he refused to let the canyon have the last word. He began retracing the friend's planned route himself, marking each step with colored ribbon. A handful of volunteers joined him, including a geologist named Dr. Amelia Hart, who had spent years mapping the rift's unstable geology. For days they found little just disturbed soil, broken twigs, faint footprints, but then the tracks ended suddenly at the edge of a jagged cliff. Beyond it, nothing. No scree slope, no hidden path, only a sheer drop into darkness, and yet the wind rising from the chasm smelled damp, mossy, almost like breath. On the 6th day of their independent search, Elias, Dr. Hart, and 2 volunteers followed a faint breeze carrying the scent of wet stone. It led them off the mapped trail to a narrow ravine where a waterfall spilled like a silver veil over the rock face. Behind the curtain of water, the stone looked different, darker, pitted, as if worn by more than erosion. Pushing aside the falling spray, Elias felt an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. They switched on headlamps and stepped inside. At once, the temperature dropped, and a low, steady hum vibrated in their ribs, not loud but undeniable, like the bass note of some buried organ. The walls glistened with moisture and something else, a faint green glow from mats of moss that pulsed slowly, as though breathing. Dr. Hart brushed her fingers along the stone and found shallow carvings etched into the surface. Spirals. Eyes. Intersecting lines like maps of impossible tunnels. The deeper they went, the more deliberate the markings became. In some sections, the carvings weren't cut, but grown, as if the rock itself had shaped them. Not natural, she murmured. Someone or something left warnings here. They moved deeper. The passage bent sharply, then opened into a cavern so vast their lamps barely reached the ceiling. Roots like enormous cords hung from above, dipping into pools of black water. Some roots glowed faintly, giving off a phosphorescent sheen. Every so often, a whisper threaded through the hum too soft to understand, yet unmistakably speech. Elias froze. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard Harper's laugh echo from somewhere beyond the roots. The sound faded, replaced by the steady pulse of the cavern. In that moment, he knew 2 things. The legends of the hollow vein were real, and they were standing inside it. The cavern expanded into a cathedral-like chamber, walls slick with moisture and illuminated by the faint, green bioluminescence of hanging roots. In the center, a tangled mass of roots writhed gently, pulsating as if alive. Elias froze when he heard it. A soft, unmistakable laugh carried through the chamber. Harper. Noah's camera, which they had retrieved earlier, would have been useless here. The shapes of the missing friends began to emerge within the roots, like reflections in dark water. Faces pale, expressions twisted with fear and wonder. It was impossible to tell where human ended and root began. The cavern seemed to absorb their very presence. Dr. Hart stepped forward cautiously. "It's alive," she breathed. "The hollow vein, it's a living labyrinth. It feeds on energy, maybe memories. It hasn't harmed them, not exactly. It's holding them." Every attempt to touch or cut the roots was met with subtle resistance, like the labyrinth itself was aware of intrusion. Faint whispers threaded through the chamber, fragments of voices. Lucas. Isla. Help. Elias realized that the vein could communicate through thought, memory, even fragments of consciousness. The missing friends were trapped, conscious yet suspended in a liminal state. The journal's warning echoed in his mind. To free what is bound, you must offer a piece of yourself. Without hesitation, Elias pressed his hand to a glowing root. A surge of energy coursed through him, visions of the friend's last moments flooding his mind, alongside hidden chambers and impossible tunnels. The vein wasn't malevolent. It was curious, alive, and hungry for connection, but in a way incomprehensible to humans. The roots pulsed violently as he engaged, then softened. The friends' faces began to separate from the mass, one by one. Harper, Elias's close friend. Isla, struggling but blinking in awareness. Sienna, fragile and frightened. Noah and Elias's presence merging into the roots' pattern as if recognizing the effort. Slowly, carefully, the living labyrinth released them. As they emerged, the hidden tunnel behind the waterfall sealed itself almost seamlessly, leaving no trace that anyone had been inside. The hollow vein had withdrawn, watching but patient. Elias, Dr. Hart, and the 5 friends returned to the moonlit forest outside, their hearts pounding, minds reeling. The vein remained below, alive, aware, and utterly incomprehensible. A secret of the earth, waiting for the next souls brave enough to enter. The 5 friends embraced under the pale moonlight, laughing and crying at once. Everything had changed. Greywater Bay looked the same, but the world was no longer merely physical. It contained something ancient, sentient, and unforgettable, and they had been marked by it forever. The 5 friends, exhausted but alive, sat beneath the moonlit canopy outside the Ashen Rift. The forest was quiet, almost reverent, as if the trees themselves had witnessed their ordeal. Elias glanced at Harper, Isla, Sienna, Noah, and Dr. Hart. Each face carried a mixture of relief, awe, and the faint shadow of lingering fear. What was that? Harper whispered, voice trembling. How can something like that exist? Elias shook his head. I don't think it's evil, he admitted. It's curious, alive. It wanted us to understand it, but on its own terms. Dr. Hart, jotting notes in her worn journal, added, The hollow vein is a living labyrinth. It preserves memory, absorbs energy, maybe even consciousness itself. It's patient, deliberate. It will wait. The friends stayed silent for a long time, listening to the faint night sounds. Somewhere deep in the canyon, the vein pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. None of them could forget the whispers, the glowing roots, the glimpses of their own faces within the labyrinth. When they finally returned to Greywater Bay, the town appeared unchanged. Life continued as if nothing had happened. Yet for the 5 friends, everything had shifted. Ordinary conversations, the sound of water in the river, even the feel of stone beneath their fingers carried echoes of the vein. They were marked forever by something ancient, sentient, and incomprehensible. And though the Ashen Rift now lay silent beneath the moon, Elias knew the hollow vein remained alive, patient and curious, waiting for the next souls brave or foolish enough to step inside. Some mysteries, he realized, are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered, respected, and feared. And this one would endure long after they were gone.